Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Anna Soslova. I'm part of the marketing team here at Axonius. In case you're not familiar with Life as a CISO, this is our webinar series spotlighting influential security leaders from across the industry. And in today's webinar, you'll hear a Q&A session between our host, Lenny Zeltser, who is the CISO at Axonius, and Larry Whiteside Jr., CTO of CyberClan and president of ICMCP. Before I hand it over to Lenny and Larry, I just wanted to give our audience a quick reminder that this session is being recorded, so you'll be able to access it after the webinar wraps up. If you have any questions for Larry throughout the session, please feel free to pose them in the Q&A section or the chat within Zoom. And with that, I'd like to thank both Larry and Lenny for being here today, and I'll pass it over to you, Lenny, to get started.
All right. Well, Larry, so glad that you're here. I'm so looking forward to this conversation and getting to know you. And I thought I'd start by asking you, how do you introduce yourself in a professional setting, given how much experience and different roles you've accumulated in your career so far? Where do you start?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting question. It sort of depends on the audience, right? If I'm in an audience of CISOs and we're talking about, CISO type stuff, security leadership, that type of thing, I tend to announce myself based on the role I have in the industry. If I'm in a place where we're going to be talking about diversity and equality and inclusion, I tend to introduce myself related to ICMCP, right? So it really depends on the conversation, who the audience is, and sort of what my purpose is for being there.
So at a very high level, can you tell the audience members who don't know you professionally, what is that background and what is ICMCP?
Yep, it's a tongue twister, right? So
I was thinking of ICMP, but yeah.
And I've been in the industry this year 28 years, right? And technically, I started thinking I wanted to be a developer. I thought, but I turned into being asked to break code because I was in COBOL and I hated it. I was doing an internship at Motorola and it was so bad. It was so horrible. And then I was asked to break code. So that was for me my entrance into the mindset of what is the field today of cybersecurity, right? Back then, we didn't call it cybersecurity. We didn't write. You didn't even really look at code as being a component of cybersecurity, right? But now with DevSecOps, if you think about the whole gambit of where we're at, that's how I sort of come up with, well, wow, my career actually started when I was breaking code. So it's interesting when I think back about it. But as I transition, right, the really big thing that happened to me was going into the military. So both of my grandfathers were Tuskegee Airmen, and they pushed very heavily for me to join the military. I was not a fan. I did not want to join the military. I had zero plans to ever join the military, but it was at the behest of them and graduating college and not really being able to find the job that I wanted that I said, you know what, okay, let me get my commission and go into the Air Force. And so that was really my thrust into the world of information security and thrust into the world of what is today cyber. And so I did 8.5 years in the Air Force. I got out and I've had a number of different roles with different companies on the consulting side, and then a lot on the C-level CISO side, and healthcare, energy, oil and gas, right? A little bit of everything. But it's just been a journey, right? Because each one of them was similar and unique at the same time, but they've given me, and they, from large companies, 85,000 global users to small companies, 2,500 global users, right? And so having each of these different types of environments and different requirements and everything has sort of brought me to this point and given me this big scope of what this field looks like and a lot of experience in the good, bad, and ugly of where we are and what's gotten us here today.
And now what about the ICMCP? Where does that come in?
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? So with all of the stuff in security I did, with all the roles that I've had, all the speaking engagements that I've done globally, and 6 years ago, 2014, I sort of had this epiphany that like, I'm not seeing enough people that look like me here, right? Whether it's speaking at events that I was attending or even an attendance at events that I was attending. And so I began having conversations with people around, hey, if someone put together an org to sort of, try and change this, would you fund it? Would somebody write a check to actually support this? Well, one of my mentors happened to be a mentor of another friend of mine as well. Well, this other friend of mine, Devin and Carlos, they were both having the same conversation with people from the standpoint of, hey, we want to form an organization to do this, right? And that mentor basically said, you two should talk because you guys are asking the same question and coming at it from different angles. And so we sat down and talked, and ICMCP was born. Right? It just sort of came to life because all of us were seeing the problem and all of us wanted to figure out how we could do something, but we recognized we couldn't do it by ourselves. So we went out and started asking people. And it was this mentor, right? This co-mentor that we both had that sort of brought us together to then enable us to sort of think broadly and say, hey, you see it's a problem? I see it's a problem too. Well, how about we try and solve this together? And that was the beginning of the larger conversation that built ICMCP and has started building further and further to where we are today.
It's amazing the power that like-minded individuals can have when they get together. Sometimes it's hard for them to meet each other, and you rely on mentors, joint acquaintances, and friends. And when I think about the challenges of building diverse teams in security, us existing in silos makes the problem harder, because even if you want to bring people who are not like you onto your team, if you're not in daily interactions with individuals who are different from you, how do you encounter them? How do you build that network? Where do you even start? Any suggestions based on your experience?
Yeah, so right, for me it's different, right? Because that is my network, right? You know, when you run in certain circles and you tend to connect with people who look like you and have a background similar to yours, right? It is when you're trying to do something different, right? And this is one of the conversations that I have quite a bit with my counterparts who are not of color, my counterparts who are not women, right? Of how do you create these circles? How do you create these networks? And I said, you have to be purposeful, right? You can't sit back and think that you can network the same way you always have. You can't sit back and think that you can participate in the thing that you've always participated in and think that you're going to get different results. So if you participated in these networking and or sharing groups, how do you then take that and move to another one that is more diverse, right? Where you're now going to interact and meet with different people to now change the model that you've been doing, right? And so it's important that you lean forward, right? And I say this a lot, lean forward, get out of your comfort zone and step into something different than what you've always been, right? So there are a number of groups, right? So ICMCP is one. You've got, we're one of only a couple. And let me restate this. So ICMCP, for us, it was important to focus on minorities and women. We don't really see them as unique to each other, right? So there are a number of organizations that focus on one or the other, right? So you have Blacks in cybersecurity, you have WITI, you have Women in Security and Privacy, you have Women in Cybersecurity, right? But we focus on both because we think the problem exists the same for both underserved communities, right? So for both minorities. So we've got to purposefully lean forward as individuals, whether you're white, whether you're brown, whether you're male, whether you're female, you've got to lean forward and recognize you're going to have to step outside of your comfort zone to be able to open yourself to new experiences, to new organizations, and to new environments to then break into and introduce yourself into these areas that are going to have the types of people that you want to engage with that don't look like you. And it's not until we do that you're going to start finding those candidates, you're going to start finding those other entities that you want to start bringing and intermingling and intertwining yourself with to give you a different perspective and a different lens on this field and how we can be better.
And as I internalize this advice and try to think, how can I apply it to me, just a very tactical thing, what this means is that when I open a position, it's not enough for me to just lean back and say, well, whoever applies, I'm going to give everybody a fair chance. Yeah, what you're saying is, well, because of the dynamics and the lack of representation from certain communities, just certain types of people will apply. And you have to take the action to make sure that others outside of your direct network are aware of the position, feel welcome in applying for it. And that's perhaps one way to interpret what you mean when you say, I lean forward and take action rather than just sit back and wait for it to happen. Yeah.
I'll give you an example, right? Companies historically, when they want to hire and they say, hey, we want to hire diverse candidates, what they do is the same thing they do when they want to hire, they don't want to hire diverse candidates. They post it on Indeed, they post it on Dice, they go to a recruiter. But when they want the person to be diverse, what they do is they sit back and they wait, hoping that they're going to get more diverse candidates. And then when they get more diverse candidates, then they'll pick from that group. But what happens is the group of diverse candidates is always small because diverse candidates will not apply for roles to which they do not nearly align 100%. And we as an industry already know that we've got issues as it relates to how job descriptions are written, right? How many job descriptions have we seen that have been written for an entry-level role that they want 1 to 3 years experience and a college degree and a certification, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, wait, how can somebody get all of those things for an entry-level position? Right? There aren't that many internships out there, right? There aren't that many apprenticeship programs out there. So how do we, so if you're doing that and you're creating roles in a way that is not enabling or allowing this diverse population to apply, A, you're not going to get them. And B, no matter how long you sit back and wait, you're never going to get the number that you're for in order to even reach into this diverse community and pick from this pool. So what you have to do is you have to sort differently. You have to go out and be purposeful and taking those job descriptions and either rewriting them or taking the actual job and purposefully putting it in front of diverse candidates and saying, hey, I want you to apply. This job is, I'm looking for people like you. I'm looking for people with backgrounds like you. You have to be very purposeful in that effort in order to draw in the type of candidates that you're looking for.
Yeah, that's solid advice for hiring managers and organizations looking to build teams. What can you say to people who are looking for jobs and want to find the best position that furthers their career? Any advice just based on your experience, what to go for, when perhaps to leave your comfort zone and take risks, or when not to? What has worked for you?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things with this. So one, that every person has to make an individual decision on when they want to take a leap. It is very easy to get into a role and get comfortable, right? It's a comfortable setting. You've got a comfortable income. You've got but if you're not being challenged, and I tell people all the time, follow your passion, right? Don't do things based on money, right? Follow your passion. If you are passionate about something, ultimately because you're passionate about it, everything that you do is going to show as relates to how you do the job. Everything you do is going to show as relates to how you accomplish the task. Everything you do is going to show as relates into how you apply yourself to everything associated with that role. So if the job you have is not part of your passion, and understand our field is, 10 miles wide at this point, right? Compared to where it was 2 decades ago, right? It is 10 miles wide at this point. We've got data scientists, we've got all, right, GRC analysts, we've got all of these different areas that you can go into. Sales, right? Who would have thought that sales would be such a huge part of the cybersecurity ecosystem from a position standpoint, right? Salespeople aren't dumb, right? They have to understand some aspect of cybersecurity. And a lot of these salespeople are now starting to become far more technical than they used to be a decade or 2 decades ago, right? And so there's all sorts of areas in our field that you can get into to figure out what it is that's your passion, and then begin to follow that, right? The NICE framework is a good mechanism to give you a good view and a good overview of what all the different types of roles are that exist out there. Go out there and read the NICE framework and see what are these different positions. Start building a career map for yourself that aligns to that passion, right? For me, I've been very blessed because I've been able to follow my passion. I love being a leader, right? And I love the field of cybersecurity. So those two things are aligned for me. And so I've been able to find roles that allow me to be a great leader in this field, right? I've been able to find roles that allow me to be a strategist, a global strategist, like I like to be in this field. And so I've aligned that because that's my passion. That's what drives me, right? Diversity, starting the not-for-profit of ICMCP, that is something that drives me. So I've been following my passion in running this organization, right? But another thing I tell people is we've got to start moving away, and this is going to take individuals to do this for it to become the groundswell that it needs to be. We've got to start moving away from the standard resume. Resumes were purposely built to show your job history.
Mm-hmm.
Rarely can a resume in its current form demonstrate your passion, right? So as I talk about following passion, you've got to find a way in your resume to document the things that are your passion, because typically if something is your passion, you're not just doing it 8 to 5, right? Especially for the mid-level managers and down. I know one of the best hires I've ever made in my entire life was a guy I hired out of DevOps, and he was in DevOps. But the reason I hired him is because what I saw was his passion for security and for application security, where he had built his own AWS secure environment. He had built his own environment that he was running himself outside of what he was doing at work every day. And what he did though was he communicated that via his resume, where on his resume, he had a section about what was his passion. Right? And so if you think about that, that drew me in. And you can ask a number of hiring managers, and I dare to say, because the ones I've talked to have agreed with me, that they would just as assume hire someone who's got a passion for it as they would somebody who's got all the certification letters behind their name.
Yeah, passion is amazing at driving yourself towards doing a good job and growing professionally, and also at showing your employer that you really are putting in all that you can into the job. There's something that I saw recently that I read in an article about how a hiring manager should be asking about passion, that I was surprised to hear, because I've always posed questions like, well, tell me what you do outside of work, in the hopes of hearing what I do outside of work is set up my home firewall and tinker with malware in my free time. But the challenge that I didn't think about is that there are a lot of people who don't have the luxury of spending their time outside of work doing things like this, because maybe they're a single parent, or maybe they have multiple jobs. And so the advice that I read that spoke to me was pose the question a bit differently, and pose the question in terms of, if at your work you were given a chance to spend 10% of your time doing anything you want, what would it be? Oh, that's interesting. That's a slightly different way of asking what is essentially the same question. Right.
Yeah. Right. And it's interesting. So you know what I do, right? I ask the question like this: if you had your perfect world, if you had your perfect job, if you were in your Zen moment, what would you be doing professionally? Because sometimes what you'll find is sometimes it's not in security. I've actually had people that were on my security team that I helped transition out because this wasn't their passion. This wasn't what they saw as their Zen thing. This wasn't the thing that they enjoyed it. It paid them well, but this isn't what they really, truly, ultimately saw themselves doing long term. So I helped them transition into an IT role that they wanted to do, that they saw themselves doing. Right, I helped them transition. One guy actually transitioned from cyber to a lineman on the power lines. Right, he wanted to be out on the truck doing the power lines. His father had done it, and that's something he wanted to do. I will help you, because at the end of the day, if an employee is following their passion, they're going to be a far more productive employee doing what they're passionate about versus doing what they're asked to do based on a paycheck.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, I wanted to ask a clarifying question to make sure I understood you correctly. Earlier, you talked about understanding what your passion is and pursuing it. And let's assume that we're talking about people whose passion is focused on security. One of the things that I think I heard you say was that you should frame your passion not in terms of a specific job, like I'm passionate about, I don't know, threat hunting. You might like it, but that's a very specific job. I think you were talking, and that was very insightful for me to hear. You were talking about what kind of work do you do? What type of activities excite you, right?
Right. Because jobs, again, it's so broad. If you focus on the job, you're going to pigeonhole yourself, right? But if you focus on the activity, right, those the activities that you want to do and that you're passionate about can span a number of different types of roles. Right. And in some organizations, you might wear multiple hats where you can actually take those passionate activities and wear multiple hats, but doing those. In some jobs, the activity that you want to do is going to give you an even different, bigger path, because that activity is a niche that the company, right, hadn't gone out and trained anybody for, but they've always wanted it. They've just never taken the time to start building that. And if you demonstrate that, right, you may be able to begin the building of something that they've wanted to do for a long time. They just didn't realize they had somebody who had a passion for it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. When we think about following your passion and understanding, kind of charting your career forward, I wanted to talk a bit about your military experience. You mentioned you went into military without necessarily initially having passion for it, but you were persuaded. And so I wanted to ask for your perspective on this for two types of people in our audience. Some maybe are in the military and are thinking about transitioning into the private sector. Others might be, young and thinking about whether starting their career with a background and experience in the military is the right one for them. So maybe these are two separate questions. I don't know how you'd like to tackle it. Maybe let's talk about first. What type of people, if they're young, just getting started, should go into the military? What can they expect? And what kind of people should stay away from it because it's not going to be appropriate for them?
Right. So that's an interesting question, right? So I will never tell people to stay away from the military, but I would tell people, if you're going to the military, be open-minded and understand that the military is about control and structure, right? So if you're one who fights against control and structure, and one who rebels against control and structure, the military might not be for you, because that's what it is, right? However, if you're one who fights against it, but you think you need it, or it can add value to you because it may change who you are. The military, I will 100% own that the military created the man, right? Had I not gone into the military, I can absolutely certainly say that I don't think I would be who I am today. Did I learn leadership through playing collegiate basketball and high school basketball and being a basketball captain and all that? Absolutely. But there are things that going into the military taught me and gave me, and a discipline, right, and a rigor that it gave me that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So I would say there are some people who need the military because it can create who they ultimately can be. And so I think there's value. You just gotta evaluate and analyze yourself to understand if that's something you can tolerate. Because here's the deal: if you go into the military and you can't come under and find a way to create control and deal with the structure, they will put you out. And being put out of the military with anything less than an honorable discharge, you will struggle, because in our field, you're not going to be accepted, right? It's going to be hard, right? For us in our field, integrity is a huge thing. And one of the reasons that our field likes military and likes vets, because going into the military, there's an aspect of honor, there's an aspect of integrity that is automatically presumed that you have by having a successful, whether it's short or long-term military career, right? And so you can come out on the positive side of that by going into the military, getting a structure, understanding and being able to operate within it, and then come out with an honorable discharge or something to that nature. Or you can be on the other side, get in there and rebel against it, get put out, get something less than an honorable discharge, and then from a cyber standpoint, a lot of the industry from a hiring standpoint sort of be hands off, because you show this lack of ability to deal with structure, and which then turns into a questioning of the integrity and so forth.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So that's very insightful for those people who think that's a way into the industry and establish a foundation upon which you can then build, presumably in the private sector. So let's talk about how to transition into the private sector, something that you've done. And I have not been to the military, but I imagine it must be a very challenging transition for many people. Any advice?
It is, right? So because what happens is, when you're accustomed to structure and the structure of the military and very, very rank oriented, right? And having a defined hierarchy, and you get into private sector, though the hierarchy exists title wise, operationally, you're working with up and down, and it's, it's easy for, a mid-level manager to be working with a CISO and so forth on an initiative, on projects and certain things. It can be tough to transition and recognize, yes, I'm no longer in the military, so this rank structure isn't as big a hard line as it is in the military, right? And so that is the thing that most military members I know of when they transition out struggle with, is the hierarchy, right? Well, oh no, you're a C-level executive, and I'm just, I'm just an analyst, and sir, and no, we're once you get out of the military, we're people, right? We're people, and we are all focused on just trying to get the job done. And so that's the biggest struggle. But I tell all military members that I talk with who struggle with that is, do what's comfortable for you, right? Do what's comfortable for you. And over time, you will begin to work your way through it. You will get more comfortable, because in the private sector, right, there's more team building, there's more little things that you tend to do that help you remove that barrier of the hierarchy that you have, that rank structure that you have when you come out of the military. But having and being able to operate within the structure of the military makes operating in private sector a breeze, as it relates to getting your job done, as it relates to working smarter, not harder, as it relates to going above and beyond, and recognizing that, well, yeah, my job isn't just 8 to 5, right? Because in cyber, sometimes your job isn't just 8 to 5. Sometimes something happens and you're starting at 7 and you're not stopping until 9 p.m., right? You can have a 12, 14-hour day based on your role and events that are happening. And military members get that, right? Military members understand that there's no such thing as 9 to 5. They recognize that I'm paid to do a job, and my job is not done until it's complete for that day, right? It's not, but in private sector, sometimes people who don't have that background, they're like, well, I started at 9, and well, it's 5 o'clock, I should be going home. They're like, no, and then, well, okay, how am I going to get compensated for? I'm salaried, so how are you going to compensate me for these extra times? Am I going to get to make those hours up, right? And so it becomes a thing. But for every military member I've ever had work for me, I've never had a conversation where they've come to me and said, hey, so I worked an extra 6 hours today, so tomorrow I'm going to take those 6 hours. It's never been a conversation. I've always compensated them. I've always given them back their time, because I think people's time is valuable. And when I'm taking their personal time away from them, I want to make sure I give it back. But I've never once in the 28 years ever had a former military member come to me and approach me about, hey, I need that time back. Not once.
Yeah, it's commitment, and people are very driven and want to do a good job and do whatever it takes. I imagine the biggest risk there is that of burnout, right? People
right.
Who want to give it all they've got. Sometimes you need to know when to step back. I suppose as a leader, as a manager, you've got to tell people, hey,
that's our job.
You're doing a good job.
Right. That's our job. That's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the transition from the military into the private sector was one of many transitions in your career so far. The one that caught my attention also was a transition from doing internally focused security work to then switching into being having advisory responsibilities where you're helping others. What surprised you perhaps about having done the transition, and how you had to approach your job differently when you're the advisor rather than an internally focused person?
Yeah, so that was an interesting transition, because when you go into an advisor role, you have less control, right? So when you're internal, you've got the teams and you need to get stuff done, right? You're directing the teams, you're ensuring that certain things are happening, and you're following through, and you're basically, it's a project, it's an initiative, it's, and you are governing it, you're watching it, you're looking at the numbers, the budget, you're looking at the hours being spent, you're looking at all these different dynamics and what it's going to, how it's going to impact the business, how it's going to impact the bottom line, all of these different things, right? But when you're advising, you have to be able to step away, right? And that aspect of being able to step away, once you get accustomed to it, is a little freeing, right? Because you remember right? When you were in the seat doing it, and all of the things you had to go through, and all the long hours and days and nights and weekends that you went through in resolving these risk-based scenarios and problems for your organization. But then when you're an advisor, you're saying, hey, you should do these things, right? You follow this path, and then to step back and sort of say, if they don't do it, guess what? I'm not reporting to the board. Maybe this isn't so bad, right? so it becomes a different mindset. But what happens is, getting into that mindset, if you ever transition back into an operational role where you're inside, it becomes, right now you have to switch back. And that becomes a little bit more challenging again, because you're accustomed to being able to give this advice and step back and let somebody else do it. And you're like, oh, wait, well, now it's on me, right? And I've got to do it. So it's interesting. It can be freeing. And honestly, it can be, when we start talking about burnout at the CISO level, right, there's a lot of that going on. There are CISOs who are self-medicating. There are CISOs who are, drinking to self-medicate. A lot of those types of things that are happening. And there've been a lot of articles written and a lot of interviews of CISOs about it. If you look across the industry, there have been a lot of CISOs over the last 3 to 5 years who have gone out into the consultancy side of the house, starting their own little things, right? Doing virtual CISO stuff, because it's giving them the ability to take a step back, take a breath, be in that advisory type role, right? And say, you know what, I'm going to leverage the experience of me doing this over X number of years, sit in this advisor role for a little while, where I can take a breath, I can focus a little bit more time on my family or other things that I want to do, and then go back into a more operational role at some point later. And it's been quite common recently.
That's good advice. Sometimes just switching to a different type of activity, a different role, can give you a chance to recover if you've burnt out. But you make it sound like advisory consulting, easy. You need a break, don't leave for vacation, just become a consultant. But I'm sure things are not quite that easy, right? You've got, what are some of the challenges that people who are contemplating this move should know about?
Well, now you become accountable to something different, which is dollars and cents, right? So when you're an operating CISO, right, you're accountable to the leadership team to keep the organization secure. Once you go into these advisory type roles, now you're being asked to generate revenue. And now it's a dollars and cents game. And we all know, even whether you're an operational CISO, you're an advisor, dollars and cents drive everything. We're $1 trillion industry for a reason, right? And so when you're asked to generate dollars and cents, it becomes a whole nother aspect of anxiety as it relates to what you do and how you govern your activities on a daily basis. Because it's easy to say, yeah, I'm going to go in and have a conversation, right? But if you don't have customers who are willing to pay you whatever rates the consultancy is asking you to charge, if they're not willing to pay for you to have these conversations, like, it is a thing. And so you have CISOs who go into this because they think that I'm just going to start consulting and I'm going to just start CISO and it's easy and I'm going to take a break. The whole aspect of business development, the whole aspect of closing deals, all of that is challenging. And it's time consuming, where you end up spending a lot of time doing something that's not making any money. And you don't realize that until you start going through the exercise. You're like, I just spent 60 hours this week, right, trying to just do biz dev, and I made $0.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, right? And so that's the other side of advising that a lot of people don't think about and don't look at. Again, I did sort of make it seem glamorous from the operational aspect of advising, yes, but that's once you've got customers. The whole aspect of getting customers and getting people to sign on the dotted line to pay you as an advisor is a lot of work, and why you see a lot of people transitioning back into corporate, because they realize after they spent 12, 18 months in that type of role, or where they're trying to do biz dev, that it's a lot more than anticipated.
It's interesting. We keep talking about different types of transitions, right? Whether it's from one industry to another, from being an independent to working for an employer. And another type of transition that I wanted to discuss with you that I believe you've made is to broaden your role to no longer just focus on security at your current organization. I think you have a title of a CTO, correct?
Yes.
What was that like? Why did you leave us behind? And I don't know, how does it feel? Is it liberating, or is it, or do you miss focusing on just security?
So it's interesting. So I do miss focusing on just security, right? Because as a CTO, so I technically now have security and technology, right? So now I've got everything, and so it's interesting because, you know, the role of CTO, when I was asked to take it, I sort of understood what it meant, but then I began to realize that I've got, you know, external facing technology stack, internal facing technology stack, all the security stuff that I typically have in a corporate environment, right? You have all of these now nuanced things, right? Picking a CRM, picking an HR system, right? All of these other things, picking a time management system, things that as a CISO, we sort of sat on the back end of to make sure that we secured those systems when IT went and purchased them for the business, or when the business went and purchased them. But to now have the responsibility to build an ecosystem, right, of IT and security tools that play nicely together became an entirely different conversation. And so it's been interesting. I've enjoyed the journey because I'm sort of a nerd, and so I like consuming information. And so looking and seeing what all of the different CRMs that exist out there outside of just Salesforce, looking and seeing what all of the HR systems are, and what the API integrations are across all of these different things, right? Project management tools, proposal systems, and all of the things that make up the organization's IT infrastructure, plus the security of all of them. So there's a component of me that really likes the control, where now I'm not just picking the tool, right? Or now I'm not just worried about the security of the tool. I'm actually picking the tool that's going to have the best of everything, right? So the best security integration, the best IT capabilities, and the best integration across the landscape of things that I need. So I sort of like being in that position where I can, because, you know, a lot of times these things are siloed, right? HR is picking something based on their needs, but they're not thinking that it's going to have to tie into all these other things. And then here I come, the security guy, saying, well, wait, how are you going to authenticate? And we need to have, you know, it needs to have SAML2 capabilities. It needs to have this. And it's like, yeah, we don't do that. Or, yeah, no, you're going to have to upload your entire Active Directory to this. But HR is adamant that that's, you know, the system they want. So now having an aspect of control across that ecosystem, actually for me, is a lot of fun. It's actually a lot of fun.
Yeah, it does sound freeing, though. I wonder, you know, if you're just focused on technology, you see something that's just a sexy tool, you want it, it's shiny, and then all of a sudden your CISO personality speaks up. Hey, not so fast.
That's what happens. But that's what happens, because your CISO personality never goes away, right? Once you've been in the role for a while, you see that's a part of who you are, right? And so it doesn't matter how cool, how sexy the technology is, how shiny it is, all the bells and whistles. That CISO personality in you is always looking at the risk. The CISO is always looking at, where's the data, right? How's the data accessed, right? Who's going to have access to it? Where's this stored? How are my people going to get into, like, it is, you're always thinking about those things. But it's interesting to just think broader about the entire ecosystem of technology and all of these pieces. Because if you think about digital transformation, every company, whether they were forced into digital transformation due to the pandemic, or they were already on a digital transformation journey, right? The CISO sort of sits over here on the side of the digital transformation journey, saying, hey, here's some security requirements to think about as you go through it, right? But when you own the digital transformation journey and you've been a CISO and you've got that mindset, it's integrated into everything you're thinking about as you go on this transition, as you're thinking about the cloud, as you're thinking about any aspect of this new world of what your new technology ecosystem is going to look like. Security is completely interwoven into every aspect of things that you look at.
Certainly, it must be exciting to be just learning about new domains, taking on new challenges now that you're doing CTO as well as CISO type work. As you reflect on your journey, what has worked for you for building up those skills, for taking on new positions where you maybe weren't immediately qualified for? How do you learn all this stuff?
So one is always being open to learning, right? I read, right? I read magazines, I read, articles, I try my best to consume information as much as possible, right? I also spend a lot of time listening. I speak on podcasts and I speak on, webinars and things all the time, but I also listen a lot, right? I listen to webinars. I look at webinars where people are showing some different technology. I look at things that are outside my purview a lot of times, just so that I have understanding, right? And I sort of look at it as a lesson for life, right? As we grow as people, as carbon-based life forms, as I like to call us, we should always be trying to learn. We should always be trying to look at our surroundings and look at the ecosystem within which we operate, and learning more. How do I be a better human? How do I be a better technologist? How do I be a better, spouse, boyfriend, parent, whatever that is? Constantly learning, because nothing is ever going to be perfect. Nothing is ever going to, change is constant, right? If nothing else, time is fleeting and change is constant. And so if you don't recognize those things and then say, well, me constantly learning, right? Because change is constant and time is fleeting, is the only way that I'm going to continue to grow as an individual. So for me, it's always trying to find a way to consume information.
Yeah. Now I better understand something you said earlier when you talked about the importance of recognizing when you're going stale in a position, which might be a signal that it's time for you to do something else. That's, I guess, a part of learning and being aware of when it's time for you to move on and try something new. What role does formal education play in all this? I think you have a computer science degree.
No. So I've got a bachelor's of science in computer science. Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I've got a BScs, right?
Yes.
It's interesting. So I am one who I don't have a lot of formal education. I got my BS. I never went for my master's. I sat in the class with Stephen Northcutt, who's the writer of the first Information Security Management Handbook. For me and 10 of my staff sat for one of the first CISSP courses that he taught. And at that course, after 2 weeks in that course, for $5,000 each that I paid, I realized I would never take the CISSP. And I became sort of anti-certification guy. So I don't have a single certification. I did not have my master's. So for me personally, a formal education has not played a large role. But to that point, I tell people, I look at certifications and some aspects of formal education as mechanisms for people to learn. Everybody learns differently. Every individual consumes information differently, right? Even from a training standpoint. Some people can only do in-person training. That's the only way they learn. They can't do online. They don't have the ability. But some people hate in-person training and only want to do online stuff, right? So every person's got to look at themselves and figure out what is your mechanism for information consumption and learning, and utilize that. It's about how you communicate what you've learned. It's how you communicate your education, your experience, and your capabilities. That's the important part, right? Because we've gotten into, as an industry, right, and it's not our fault, it's an HR thing, right stack, left stack, right? We put these requirements out there, must have a CISSP or must have this certification, right? Must have a master's degree preferred, must have CISM, right? We put all these things out there just to create a right stack, left stack. But what we've done is, because of that right stack, left stack, we're putting people in the left stack that are qualified people that could do the job and that could really meet it. And so I've almost made it my own personal mantra to stay not getting the certifications, not going down the path of the formal education, because I want to challenge the system. I want us to think differently about how we do things. I want us to recognize that the path we've gone down and the way we've gone, we have literally created this hierarchy. Oh, if you have a PhD, oh yes. Oh, you have a master's. Oh, you have your CISSP and you have your this cert and that cert and that cert. Oh, you must be. And the reality is, no. I know many people who have none of those things who are in this industry. I know people who don't have any college degree that are in this industry that are amazing, amazing people. and have accomplished some very, very amazing things, right? And so for me, I don't look at formal education. I don't look at certifications. I don't look at anything as a mechanism. I look at you as an individual and ask you, what is your ability to consume information and learn more? Whatever that best is for you, do it. But then find a way to communicate that, right? Because as I said before, the resume is our age-old way of communicating, but that was really just purpose-built so that you can show a job history, not demonstrate your passion and not demonstrate your capabilities. And so we've got to find new mechanisms on how we can communicate that.
What you just said, there's a lot of goodness, a lot of advice packed in there. Some of that is very hard. Some of what you just said is, I think, a call to action for hiring managers to look beyond the resume, to look beyond the must-have CISSP type requirements and try to get to know the candidates. You also talked about the candidates looking or applying for jobs to look for a way to signal their passion, their proficiency, even if they don't necessarily have the certifications. My challenge with the advice that I heard you say for hiring managers is that when you're inundated with applicants, you need to make a judgment call right away, which contributes to the problem that you're talking about. But still, how do we get past it? Once you're talking to someone, then you can have a conversation. But before you talk to someone, there's a lot of steps that require fast decisions and heuristics. Yeah.
No. And so here's the thing. And you're right. So you said a key word, heuristics, right? Because a lot of this is going into an application system. That application system is then looking for key things and then pulling, right? If you've got 1,000 resumes, let's just say 100, you've got 100 resumes to get presented to you. I recognize as a hiring manager who's had to hire hundreds of people over my career that you're in a tough situation of how do you weed through this in a way that you can get to the people that are going to add value to you. But that's why this is a double-edged sword. That's why it's the combination of you as a hiring manager looking for certain things that the individual who's presenting themselves has to find a way to communicate on this piece of paper, right? And we have to find a way to communicate on this piece of paper, but also change the heuristics with which we are choosing which pieces of paper. Right? Because listen, I know so many people that are in the recruiting space right now that play the keyword game, right? Hey, right, I've got this position for this. I'm gonna change your resume up and put these keywords in it so that you'll then fit them out. Come on, aren't we just playing semantics at that point, right? But that doesn't necessarily represent who that person is, and so we've got to. And I'm not saying it's easy. Believe me, I'm not. I'm not saying this is easy by any stretch of the imagination, but we've got to start looking at additional tools, LinkedIn, social networks, other things that give you a better overall picture of who this person is. And the individuals have to start utilizing these other tools, right? LinkedIn and other things to create a better overall picture of themselves, right? Showing things that they're involved in, the places they've spoken, all of those different types of things, because then if I have an ability to create a better profile of who you are, right, besides just your job history and the keyword search, now I've got a better understanding of who you are. Now, when I'm going through these resumes, because I've got a better understanding and it's been communicated differently, now I can make a better decision. And it's not just based on these artificial things that we've created over time.
That's very insightful. Yeah. And we began this conversation with me asking you, how do you introduce yourself, right? And in a way, we're coming back to that idea where not you directly, but a person applying for a role needs to find a way to introduce themselves. And what you're saying is, yes, a resume will play a role in that, but so do other artifacts that you leave online about yourself. You're encouraging hiring managers to do a Google search, look at the person's LinkedIn profile, maybe their GitHub page and whatnot, right? But I wonder whether you have advice for people who are perhaps hesitant to boast about their achievements. Yeah, sometimes we don't want to, we think it sends the wrong signal. How do you strike the right balance at establishing your authority on a particular subject, but at the same time not sounding like an asshole who knows it all?
Yeah, so that's really in wording, right? At the end of the day, whether it's you verbally speaking or whether it is you posting an article, posting an opinion, right? Whatever that is on LinkedIn, comments in somebody else's thing, right? An opinion is your thoughts, right? And this dives way deeper into beyond just what we're talking about. If you think about where we're at holistically in the United States, emotions have gotten caught up in opinions, right? We've gotten to the state of where you have to be right or wrong. And the reality is that opinion is just somebody's opinion. And sharing an opinion should be more for understanding than it is for pointing out a flaw or pointing out whether someone else is right or wrong, right? And so when you are trying to espouse on a specific topic, if you go down the path of just sharing, hey, based on my experience, these are my thoughts, right? Versus, hey, based on my experience, this is why you're wrong, right? You're saying the same thing, but you've taken a different angle. One is much more, I'll say, I don't even know the word I want to use, right? Because one is incites someone else to respond negatively versus the other, someone's going to look at it as you just sharing. And that's where people tend to go awry when they want to talk about their knowledge. They put their knowledge across in a way where they're trying to discount or discredit the other person, right? Sharing your knowledge about a particular topic is not to necessarily discredit somebody. If you are, then yes, you are going to come across as an asshole, and you probably are being an asshole, right? But if you are sharing it just because you want to actually inform someone of another side of the coin, because there's two sides to every coin, just like they said, for every story, there's two sides to every story, right? If you're just trying to share based on your perspective, someone can take it or leave it, they can listen to it or not, but this is your perspective based on your experience. They come across differently. And I think we need to be more open to just sharing our experience, sharing our perspective, right? Without trying to discredit somebody else, but giving it to somebody like, hey, here's something else to think about, right? Those types of things, writing an article about it, writing, responding to somebody else's blog, writing your own blog about a particular thing, they then come across very differently, and people take it very differently because they then take it in and sometimes apply it and think, I hadn't considered that, versus reading it and it come across because they feel like they're being told they are wrong, or you're coming across as a know-it-all, and well, now they're going to immediately want to respond in the opposite way, right? And so it's all in this perspective of how we put this out. I'm a huge person on positivity and right, what you put out is what you get back. And if you put out negative energy, if you put out and you use words that are defeating to another person, if you put out words that are pushing another person down or stomping on another person, that's the immediate thing that you're going to start to get back.
Yeah, and there's a lot of wisdom in what you shared. I'm sure our listeners appreciate this because what you just said, it applies to many situations, both when you're, let's say, applying to a job and you want to have a trail of your thoughts and opinions that your maybe potential employer will read, and that's how they will see and understand the type of person you are professionally, your insights. But I think the same approach applies when you're in the organization and you're collaborating with other people with whom you're inevitably going to disagree, right? And who will ask you to express your opinions and the tone and the words that you use. It's the hardest aspect of communications, I think. From my perspective, it's making sure you get your point across, but at the same time, make sure that it's received well and that you have that positive approach. And I think it's very hard for security people who are oftentimes in the position of having to say no. No, you can't hire that vendor. No, you can't open the sport. No, you can't deploy that program. A lot of negativity.
No, it is. And so it's interesting, right? So an experience that I go back to right? And especially around that having to say no, right? We've been thought of as the office of no for a long, long time, right? And so when I was in the military, and again, remember the military being very rank structured, right? And I was running, I was security at the Pentagon, and I had put in some ACL, access control list control framework that began blocking access to this global application. Now, this global application was being managed out of the Pentagon by a one-star general. And this one-star general, he owned it globally. And so when I put this rule in place, I didn't know it was blocking it, but it shut their application down. So because what we would do is we would put in, if we got a port scan of any kind against the external network, we would put in a 30-day Class C block against that Class C network. So what happened was that would begin to impact embassies in different parts of the world, right? A Class C block, you know, back in the late 90s, you're going to impact something. And so he was mad. And so he comes to me, he finds out, you know, I'm responding, he's dictating to me what I'm going to do. And I'm like, sir, you know, I'm sorry, I can't do that. And so I gave him a couple of options, right? And said, you know, you can do this, or you can get a static IP, right? Those are some options you can do. You can buy this encryption device or get a static IP. And he didn't like either of those options. From his standpoint, because we were rank structured, he said, no, I'm a general, you're a captain. I'm telling you that you're going to do this. I'm like, sir, I'm sorry, I can't. Well, who's your boss? Right. So then, of course, I reported to a high ranking official. And so when we go into the meeting, he's sitting in the room already. I walk in, you know, and I say, hey, sir, how are you? And I sit down, then my boss comes behind me and sits at the head of the table. And when my boss sits at the head of the table, he turns to my boss who outranked him. And he says, you know, sir, he explains what the problem was. And so who I had already back briefed my boss, and my boss said, well, what are the options that Captain Whiteside gave you? He said, well, he said, I can do this or this. And he said, so which one are you choosing? right. And you know, as irate as he was with me during the email chain, when I met with him, right, all of those times, I never responded to him in a way. I communicated to him, listen, sir, I understand your problem, right? But you are not greater than the greater good, right? And so the risk posed that we mitigated by implementing this, right, was for the greater good. And though it impacted your system, and I understand that impact, right, I've come up with a plan to help you mitigate it, right? But it wasn't good enough for him, and he was irate. And again, because we're rank structured, he thought he was just going to dictate. And so I use that even today, right? When I was been a CISO talking to the board or talking to a business leader, right, who reported to the CEO, and I didn't. I reported into, you know, the CIO, or I reported into the CTO or something, right? And so these people theoretically outranked me as it relates to the organization, but I've always approached them, right? Yes, I know exactly what I'm talking about. I think I'm very smart. I think I'm good at what I do. But in my ability to tell you no, I'm going to do it in a way that's going to be kind, it's going to be respectful, and you're never going to get me into a position where I get irate. You're never going to get me into a position where I come at you in a way that is not completely respectful and about the particular situation. And I think sometimes a lot of people don't realize that in our industry, we get challenged with something, and because we're security, we think that we are all knowing. I've seen this happen in organizations, and people get irate. And I'm like, no, and as security people, and I'm like, listen, wait, it's okay, right? It's okay to say no, but you've got to say it in a way that they understand. And then if they don't, let's just ratchet this up, right? We take this up the food chain. And as long as you've done your due diligence, now, sometimes does the business win? Hell yeah. You know why? They generate revenue. So at the end of the day, money talks, right? And so sometimes that's okay, right? And then we have to go back and we just have to figure out and deal with, right, mitigating in a different way because the business generates revenue. But we've got to get out of our own way. We've caused a lot of the angst that we've dealt with over the last 2 decades because of our approach to the business.
Yeah. I mean, being kind, being respectful, those are certainly words to live by. And those might be the words for us to end this session with, as we have run out of time. Larry, thank you so much for your insights. I learned a ton. I'm sure people who tuned in did as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Larry, for participating in the session today, and Lenny for moderating this Q&A. And thanks again to our audience for joining us today. Like I mentioned, we recorded this session, so you'll get a copy in the next few hours. In the meantime, if you need anything or have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me at anna@axonius.com, and I'll get you to the right person. Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.